On June 30th, 2025, a liquefied natural gas vessel quietly departed from Kitimat Port, but that departure is rewriting the global energy order. After 3 decades of being strangled within the pipeline network to the U.S., Canada has carved out its own path, straight to Asia, leaving behind both Trump's tariffs and strategic dependence. This is not just a shipment of LNG. It is the economic declaration of a nation reshaping its position on the world energy map. The departure that opened an escape from the shackles of the pipeline. There were no fireworks, no national anthem chorus rising from the ship's deck. But at dawn on June 30th, 2025, at a remote Pacific coast port in Kitimat, British Columbia, Canada, made a historic turning point. A vessel carrying 2.66 million tons of liquefied natural gas, LNG, quietly departed, yet created a deep tremor on the global energy geopolitics map. It was not just a shipment. It was the first step of a nation cutting off its economic chains with the U.S. after more than 3 decades of dependency. For a long time, Canada lived in the shadow of its southern neighbor, a reality written through price pressure, the daily flow of 8.8 billion cubic feet of gas through pipelines toward the border, and a series of trade policies that only benefited Washington. For over 30 years, despite possessing massive natural gas reserves and abundant clean resources, Canada was forced to send its gas through the U.S. pipeline system, a choice that was both convenient and precarious, as it was tied to the so-called conditional alliance. The crisis didn't erupt from geology, but from policy. When the Trump administration, at the start of 2025, suddenly imposed a 10% import tax on energy from Canada, a warning shot disguised as national energy security protection, every sense of stability was wiped away by a single executive signature. Canada's energy sector was shaken, not because gas prices plunged, but because it realized the so-called friendly market could turn into a vice grip at any moment. The first LNG ship leaving Kitimat was the answer to that suffocation. It was not a hasty reaction, but the result of many years of silent strategic planning, and the clearest expression of Canada's desire for independence. By reaching the open sea, the country for the first time opened a new energy trade corridor that bypassed the United States, bypassed the pipelines, and, most importantly, bypassed Washington. Why is this action considered a turning point? Because, in the world of gas, infrastructure isn't just a technical issue. It's a symbol of power. Whoever controls the pipeline controls the flow of profits, controls the pricing, and controls the economic survival of the other side. For many years, the U.S. used its gas infrastructure network as a form of coercive diplomacy, no different from how Russia once did with Europe. Now, as Canada opens its own maritime route, it means a withdrawal from a near-total form of dependency and opens the possibility of restructuring the entire North American LNG supply chain. But beyond geopolitical meaning, this event also awakened previously overlooked markets. Japan, South Korea, and China, countries that once relied heavily on LNG from the U.S., Qatar, and Australia, now see a new supplier, clean, stable, and politically low risk. Instead of transporting through Panama or waiting for taxed contracts, they can access Canadian LNG directly after just 10 days at sea. And this, more than any diplomatic statement, has elevated Canada to a whole new level of influence. However, this pivot was not merely the result of trade calculation. It reflected a long-suppressed frustration in Canada's economic policy. The frustration of a nation constantly viewed as an extension of the U.S., despite having its own identity and potential. Choosing to end the era of pipeline-only exports to the U.S. was a deeply symbolic act, a declaration of independence not by words, but through a new trade corridor across the ocean. From Kitimat to the port of Yokohama, that first LNG vessel carried more than gas, it carried ambition. The ambition for energy autonomy, the ambition to break free from geopolitical constraints, and above all, the ambition to be recognized as a true global power in the 21st century. And that silent beginning, no fireworks, no parade, was the strongest declaration of all. Canada has chosen its own path, and this time it didn't ask Washington for permission. When tariffs became a declaration of dependence, no one thought that a single signature in the Oval Office could shake billions of dollars in natural gas value per day. But that is exactly what happened in early March 2025 when the Trump administration announced new import tariffs, 25% on most Canadian goods and 10% specifically on energy products, including natural gas. In a single moment, the entire trade structure between the two North American nations was put back on the scale, and this time the balance no longer tipped towards stability. That tariff policy did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of a long string of simmering tensions in U.S.-Canada economic relations, beginning the moment the slogan "America First" was uttered, not at a campaign rally, but at global trade negotiation tables. In the eyes of the Trump administration, a close partner like Canada was no longer a companion, but a line item in a trade balance that Washington was determined to reverse at any cost. Canada had once been the perfect customer for the U.S. Nearly 100% of its exported natural gas flowed across the southern border, generating $8 billion in revenue in 2024 alone. But with the new tariff, those numbers were no longer symbols of success. They became evidence of absolute dependence. In the LNG market, where every cent determines survival, a 10% tariff could collapse an entire supply chain like a domino effect. The consequences rippled out immediately. Long-term gas contracts, once signed with the expectation of stability, became financial burdens. Many energy companies in Alberta and British Columbia were forced to renegotiate sale prices or cancel agreements altogether, as the tariff pushed the price of Canadian gas higher than U.S. domestic LNG, which was trading at an average of $3.74 per million BTU, while Canada's AECO index hovered around $714 per million BTU. When a product that was 5 times cheaper suddenly becomes more expensive due to tariffs, the market needs no further reason to walk away. However, the tariff shock wasn't just about price. It underscored the fragility of the power structure Canada had placed its trust in for decades. An economy cannot be called independent if most of its revenue must pass through a rival that can rewrite the rules with a single executive order. In Ottawa's eyes, this wasn't simply a trade dispute. It was a wake-up call about a subtle but deep form of control. Control through infrastructure, through dependency on outlets, and ultimately through policies that can shift with every U.S. political cycle. In reality, Americans were also affected, just in a different way. Gas importers, long accustomed to cheap northern supply, now faced a hard choice: accept higher prices due to tariffs, or turn to domestic and Asian LNG sources, where pricing is volatile and shipping distances are much longer. Several power companies in New England and the Northeast began sounding alarms about the risk of unstable supply, especially for the coming winter. Even the chemical industry, which relies heavily on natural gas as a feedstock, raised concerns about potential production disruptions. Beneath the banner of national economic protection, Trump's tariff policy exposed a stark truth. Canada cannot survive on the goodwill of the United States, especially in an era where alliances can be revalued based solely on trade deficit charts. Without creating its own trade corridors, Canada would remain trapped in a game whose rules are written in Washington. It was in that context that the strategic withdrawal from a one-way export model ceased to be a choice, and became a survival imperative. From the offices of the Ministry of Natural Resources to investment boardrooms in Calgary, from Indigenous councils on the West Coast to energy experts in Ottawa, everyone understood. Tariffs weren't just a short-term issue. They were a message about the urgent need to redirect the entire structure of national exports. The tariff crisis of 2025 ended faster than many expected, not because the U.S. rescinded its policy, but because Canada managed to create an exit route in time. But the lesson remains. No stability is permanent if built on a foundation of dependence, and no nation is truly sovereign if it cannot control the path its goods take to reach the world. LNG Canada, when a project became a nation's life-or-death choice. In the moment Canada realized it had no option but to sever its trade dependency on the United States, LNG Canada, a name once buried deep in technical investment reports, rose up as a historical pivot. No longer just a simple energy project, no longer a 1,000-page engineering document in British Columbia's planning archives, LNG Canada had become a full-scale counterstrike, not at the negotiating table, but on the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Valued at 40 billion Canadian dollars, LNG Canada is one of the largest energy infrastructure projects in the country's history. But what makes it remarkable isn't the number, it's the timing. Because when Washington turned tariffs into an economic weapon, Kitimat, a remote stretch of coastline in the West, unexpectedly became the front line in the battle to reshape North American energy trade. LNG Canada was not born into favorable conditions. On the contrary, it emerged from challenges that once seemed insurmountable. Harsh terrain, high construction costs due to the frigid climate in northern British Columbia, and environmental pressure from conservation groups and Indigenous communities had long made investors hesitant. For more than a decade, the project faced delays, design adjustments, changes in financial partners, and at times seemed destined to be removed from the national strategic agenda. But precisely because of that, when it was completed, LNG Canada was no longer just a facility. It became a symbol of strategic endurance and the ability to reshape a nation's destiny. At the heart of the project is the 670-kilometer Coastal GasLink pipeline, connecting the Montney Basin shale gas fields in Dawson Creek to the liquefaction terminal in Kitimat. On a map, it's a simple line. But on the ground, every kilometer of that pipeline represents a negotiation, a passage through dense forests, frozen lands, and wetlands, where machines alone were not enough. It required social consensus. And notably, instead of suppressing opposition, the government and corporations chose a different path. Direct negotiation, benefit sharing, and granting participatory rights to Indigenous communities like the Haisla Nation. This was not just a social gesture. It was the only way to keep the project alive in an era when legitimacy comes not from permits, but from public acceptance. The partnership between global corporations like Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Kogas was also a critical factor. Because relying solely on domestic capabilities, Canada could not have independently mobilized enough capital, technology, and market access for a project of global scale. But the participation of major Asian energy players brought not just funding, it brought future customers, Japan, South Korea, and China. They didn't invest out of goodwill, but because they clearly saw a new route for clean, stable gas that bypassed Panama, stayed far from Middle Eastern tensions, and, most importantly, was unaffected by Washington's unpredictable fury. Once completed, LNG Canada houses 2 liquefaction trains with a total capacity of 14 million tons of LNG per year, powered by clean hydroelectricity from BC to reduce CO2 emissions and achieving one of the lowest ESG, environmental, social, governance, ratings globally. This isn't just PR. In a world where investment funds are rapidly pulling out of dirty fossil fuel projects, a high ESG rating is a prerequisite for long-term financing. Thanks to that, LNG Canada became a destination not only for gas, but for responsible capital. From a geopolitical perspective, LNG Canada is a declaration through action that Canada no longer accepts the role of pump station for US-bound gas. With the ability to cut delivery time from North America to Asia from 20 days to just 10, entirely avoiding risks in the Strait of Hormuz or the Panama Canal, this project opens a new energy corridor, faster, cheaper, and politically more neutral than any competitor. That's why LNG Canada isn't just infrastructure. It's a strategic decision. It doesn't just help the country exit the old game. It creates a new set of rules. In an era where every unit of gas carries geopolitical weight, Kitimat has become the starting point for a shift in energy power. From deep underground, through steel pipelines, to the docks of Asia. And this time, Canada is no longer the middleman. They are the ones paving the way. When fairness begins with every gas column and every kilometer of pipeline. Behind every megaton of LNG leaving Kitimat are thousands of Canadian hands that quietly built a miracle, not only with concrete, steel, and hydroelectricity, but with a concept long overlooked in mega projects: fairness. In the ambitious and cold-blooded energy world of the 21st century, where profit often drowns out community voices, the LNG Canada project chose a different path, one that is both thorny and full of hope, by placing ESG at the core from day one. To fully understand the revolutionary nature of LNG Canada's approach, one must look at the broader picture facing the global energy industry. For decades, the concept of clean fuel was merely a label. Mining corporations might meet environmental standards on paper, yet leave behind marginalized communities, depleted rivers, and flattened forests. However, LNG Canada, with its harsh geography and dense Indigenous presence, had no room to repeat those mistakes. Not because of moral pressure, but because of a political survival equation. From the early stages, the Haisla Nation, one of the long-standing Indigenous communities near the Kitimat Port, was not someone to be convinced. They were invited to the negotiation table as equal partners. Not only did they sign supply contracts worth over 5.88 billion Canadian dollars, but they were also granted equity ownership in the Coastal GasLink pipeline, a move unprecedented in the history of Canadian energy megaprojects. This not only allowed the community to maintain cultural sovereignty, but also made them part of the value chain, where profits no longer flowed solely to international headquarters. When Indigenous people are no longer a barrier to overcome, but become co-creators, the entire economic logic changes. Social acceptance, that intangible asset which determines a project's fate, is now reinforced by direct participation. This helped LNG Canada overcome many legal obstacles that other projects failed to navigate due to community resistance. There were no large-scale protests, no lawsuits dragging on for years, only concrete commitments carried out through real actions, from local labor training and technical support to preserving traditional lifestyles alongside industrial operations. In addition to the social aspect, the project meets impressive environmental standards. The entire liquefaction facility in Kitimat uses clean hydroelectricity from British Columbia, helping reduce CO2 emissions to among the lowest levels of any LNG exporter in the world. In a context where global investment funds increasingly prioritize ESG in their capital decisions, this is a competitive advantage that cannot be measured in BTUs or tons of gas. It is trust, the ability to attract long-term funding not only from corporations, but also from global financial institutions seeking green and sustainable destinations. Importantly, those ESG standards are not cheap. Operating in the cold climate of the North, coupled with high biodiversity conservation requirements, force the joint venture to invest hundreds of millions of Canadian dollars in emissions reduction technology, gas treatment systems, and the protection of wild habitats. While projects in the Gulf of Mexico might bypass many of these costs, LNG Canada had to choose the harder road, but also the most sustainable one in the long term. British Columbia, recognizing the special role of the project, proactively issued carbon tax and sales tax incentives to offset ESG costs for investors. However, these very policies also sparked public debate about the boundaries of responsible incentives. Many questioned whether tax reductions for energy corporations truly bring equitable benefits to society as a whole, or whether they create a precedent of unfair favoritism. The answer remains unclear, but at the very least, LNG Canada's approach, transparent, community-inclusive, and held to high standards from the outset, has offered a model worth contemplating. In a world where terms like clean energy, green transition, and social responsibility often appear only on glossy reports, LNG Canada proves that a mega-project can indeed stand firmly on three substantive ESG pillars. And more importantly, it shows that Canada is not just exporting natural gas, but exporting a new model of ethical industrial development. In an era where markets are no longer just places for buying and selling, but spaces for evaluating a nation's character, those seemingly non-economic details become the most valuable passport of all. Asia opens its doors, and Canada knocked at the right moment. When the vessel carrying 2.66 million tons of LNG left Kitimat Port on the morning of June 30, 2025, heading toward the Pacific, no one needed a map to understand that the most important destination at that moment was Asia. Amid a sweeping global energy crisis, where Europe was struggling to replace Russian gas, and Asia thirsted for a clean, stable, and non-political energy source, Canada's emergence was nothing short of a timely greeting. A country that once stood outside the global LNG chessboard has now become the missing piece eagerly awaited by the entire Northeast Asian region. In reality, no market in the world is as hungry for clean gas as Asia. Japan, the world's third-largest economy, is grappling with phasing out nuclear power post-Fukushima and reducing reliance on coal amid soaring carbon prices. Over 80% of Japan's electricity currently depends on imported natural gas, and the country has announced plans to increase LNG imports by at least 20 million tons per year starting in 2026. Meanwhile, South Korea, with one of the fastest industrial electrification rates, has set a goal to expand its national LNG storage capacity by 50% over the next decade. And then there is China, quiet but swift in action. In just the first half of 2025, Beijing signed a series of long-term contracts worth tens of billions of USD to secure stable gas supply for the upcoming winter. It was in this context that Canada didn't need a massive marketing strategy. It just needed to show up, and at the right time. The competitive advantage of LNG Canada doesn't lie in pure low pricing like Qatar, nor in a massive transport network like the US. It lies in political neutrality, in a vastly shorter delivery time, just 10 days instead of 20 via Panama, and in one intangible yet critical factor in a chaotic era: trust. That trust stems from multiple layers. First is institutional stability. No risk of disruption from war, sanctions, or energy nationalism. Second is ESG. When importers in Tokyo or Busan must report to their boards and shareholders that they are buying from a clean, transparent source endorsed by the international community. And finally, trust in the execution capability of a G7 country with a history of legal clarity and consistent trade practices. That's why, the moment LNG Canada officially went into operation, Asian markets responded immediately with tangible signals. Within less than 3 weeks of the first shipment, Japan's 3 largest LNG ports, Yokohama, Niigata, and Osaka, simultaneously opened direct negotiation channels with LNG Canada representatives to discuss mid- and long-term import contracts. Singapore, the region's energy hub, also scheduled an assessment of the feasibility of integrating LNG Canada into ASEAN's strategic reserve system. From a nation that was nearly absent from the Trans-Pacific LNG trade map, Canada has now created a direct export corridor. Bypassing intermediaries, bypassing U.S. pipelines, and bypassing strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Panama Canal. That's not just a change in shipping routes, it's a shift in the balance of influence. When a country can directly supply clean energy to Asia's leading consumer nations, it isn't just selling gas, it's selling geopolitical standing. However, to fully exploit this potential, Canada cannot stop at being on time. It must maintain momentum, must lock in long-term contracts before the US, Australia, or Qatar expand their capacity. The LNG game is not for those who rest after a strong start. It is a marathon of trust, logistical capability, and above all, adaptability in pricing and financial strategies. If Ottawa does not aggressively support the expansion phase, if the LNG Canada joint venture does not quickly secure sufficiently large offtake commitments, then the door now open could quietly close before anyone notices. But at this moment, Canada's presence in Asia is a victory in both geoeconomics and strategy. It shows that in an era where energy has become a global bargaining chip, nations that can stay above political frays while providing stable, clean, and fast energy are the ones rewriting the rules. And Canada, after years on the sidelines, has stepped onto the stage, not with a proclamation, but with the quietest and most timely LNG shipment of our time. Ambitious leap, when 14 million tons is just the beginning. No strategic vision ever stops at a round number. When LNG Canada officially entered Phase 1, operations with a capacity of 14 million tons per year, observers knew this was just the starting point, not the destination. And in reality, what is happening within the joint venture reveals one thing more clearly than anything else. Canada is preparing for a double leap, with ambitions to raise capacity to 28 million tons per year, putting the country among the world's top 5 LNG exporters. Behind this decision is not temporary enthusiasm, but the convergence of extremely strong market signals. After the first shipment arrived in Asia, the number of inquiries, negotiations, and preliminary contracts from Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Singaporean customers surged. Not only state-owned power corporations, but also industrial, chemical, and maritime shipping companies began lining up, because they recognized that LNG Canada is not just an energy supply, but also a solution to escape geopolitical risk, something that holds no numerical value in contracts, yet is vital in today's volatile environment. However, realizing the ambition to double capacity is where the real difficulty begins. Phase 2 cannot be built on enthusiasm, but must be supported by tens of billions of Canadian dollars in new investment, supplemental infrastructure, and especially large enough long-term offtake commitments to serve as financial foundations. While Phase 1 benefited from the pioneer aura and special policy incentives from British Columbia, Phase 2 will have to enter direct competition with global giants like Qatar Energy, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Woodside Energy, competitors pouring hundreds of billions of USD into capturing the Asian market before 2030. The issue lies here. The Asian market is heating up by the day, but has never been more demanding. LNG purchase contracts are no longer signed with the mindset of any price as long as there's supply. On the contrary, requirements for flexible price ceilings, transportation risk insurance, and strict ESG standards are becoming prerequisites. This forces LNG Canada to move beyond the clean or stable advantage and prove its ability to optimize costs, expand logistics, and maintain a steady supply from the Montney Basin in the long run. Still, the joint venture is not alone. Major partners like Shell, Petronas, Mitsubishi, PetroChina, and Kogas have all expressed readiness to increase their investment if market conditions hold momentum. Notably, Shell, acting as the operating partner, is rushing to complete the Phase 2 feasibility study, FEED, expected to finish by the end of Q1 2026. A final investment decision, FID, will likely be announced right after Phase 1 reaches 85% of actual capacity, as part of a parallel run strategy to stay ahead of US and Australian competitors accelerating their own build-outs. However, obstacles do not only come from technical and market fronts. Domestic politics is also a variable that must be closely monitored. Environmental groups in British Columbia have begun questioning the expansion limits of a large-scale LNG project in light of Canada's commitment to CO2 emissions reduction under the Paris Agreement. Some lawmakers in Ottawa have even warned that if Phase 2 does not come with clear carbon neutrality measures, the project could face federal legal barriers, or worse, lose part of its tax incentives. That is why, alongside the expansion plan, LNG Canada engineers are also researching the integration of carbon capture and storage CCS technology directly at Kitimat, a solution once considered remote but now a matter of survival. The vision of a net-zero LNG facility, meaning zero net emissions, is no longer a dream, but a calculated commercialization strategy that helps Canada maintain its image as a truly clean energy supplier in the global market. All of this shows the game is entering Phase 2, not just in terms of scale, but in strategic depth. And Canada, though currently in a leading position, will still have to prove that it can not only blaze the trail, but go farther, faster, and more sustainably than the giants that once dominated this game. Phase 1 was a successful trial, but Phase 2 will be the true test of national resolve. If it succeeds, Canada will not only rise to the top of LNG exports, but also redefine a new standard for 21st century energy: strong, clean, and responsible. And on that journey, every exported ton of gas is not just a trade unit, but a statement of sovereignty in a world seeking balance from chaos. Energy freedom, when Canada is no longer a hostage to pipelines. For more than 3 decades, Canada's natural gas flowed southward like an unconscious reflex. Every day, around 8.6 billion cubic feet of natural gas crossed the border, entering U.S. pipeline systems. And there, the fate of an entire economic sector was dictated by decisions made in a distant capital. Pricing, tax rates, technical standards, negotiating leverage, all beyond Ottawa's control. But by the summer of 2025, when the first LNG shipment sailed from Kitimat to Asia, the most important detail wasn't the destination, it was what it bypassed. It didn't need Washington. Breaking free from pipeline monopolies was a structural victory. This was not a momentary dodge to avoid harsh tariff policy, but a strategic liberation from a century of dependency. Because in energy, infrastructure is not just a means, it is power. Whoever controls infrastructure controls cash flow, negotiating conditions, and even the survival of suppliers. For years, the U.S. didn't need to declare Canada an energy satellite. The trade dynamics had already defined that role. But with LNG Canada, The game changed. Now, Ottawa has its own route, its own market, and above all, its own leverage. The difference is stark in every contract. Previously, most Canadian gas was sold based on U.S. pricing benchmarks, primarily the Henry Hub, an index that doesn't reflect Alberta's production costs or Asia's actual demand. When the U.S. imposed a 10% tariff in early 2025, Canadian energy companies had virtually no countermeasures, as their entire export ecosystem was tied to U.S. infrastructure and domestic value chains. This pushed many long-term contracts to the brink of collapse and forced the federal government to confront a serious question. Can a critical industry like energy have a future without infrastructure sovereignty? The answer came from Kitimat. From each LNG container loaded directly onto ships, with no need to connect to anyone else's pipeline system. More than 170 ships per year, starting in 2026, will not only carry gas farther, but also carry a message. Canada now sets its own value, with no intermediaries, no one-sided negotiations with a sole partner. The ripple effects of this shift stretch beyond the export market, into the domestic one as well. Creating a direct export safety valve has allowed Canada to avoid domestic price suppression due to lack of alternative outlets. At the time of the U.S. tariffs, average prices at Canadian trading hubs like AESO hovered around 0.714 million British thermal units per million British thermal units, while U.S. producers sold at Henry Hub for more than 5 times that. This disparity, partly due to transportation dependency, turned Canada's entire gas value chain into a profit sink. But now, with the ability to sell directly to Asia at international market rates, Canadian producers are no longer bound by a disadvantageous pricing structure. Of course, this path is not without obstacles. Maintaining independence requires higher operational costs, especially in the harsh environment of northern British Columbia. But as an immutable rule, freedom always has a price, and for Canada, that's a price worth paying to gain control over markets, branding, and global standing. This is especially critical as future energy crises, from climate change, geopolitics, to supply chain disruptions, demand that every nation have more than one survival plan. More important is the long-term impact. Breaking away from the export via U.S. model forces Canada to restructure its thinking from the ground up. From storage management, port infrastructure planning, to logistics workforce training and renegotiation with local communities. There's no longer room for a development model based on shortcuts across the southern border. Every strategy now must account for the Pacific Ocean, the Asian market, and global standards. What was once optional is now imperative. And like every historic milestone, what remains is not a singular event, but a chain reaction. LNG Canada doesn't just help Canadian gas reach the ocean, it helps Canada reconnect with itself. A nation with resources, organizational capacity, and the ability to stand on its own economic feet without needing a permission slip from Washington. That is freedom no one gives. It can only be claimed through strategy, investment, and national resolve. And once claimed, it's not easily lost.